Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I have recently finished reading. And as you can see behind me, things have been busy around here. We are in the process of course, I don't want to jinx anything. Knock on wood, sorry for the camera shaking. We should be moving hopefully soon. But there's definitely more of an echo in this room now. You can see boxes next to me filled with books. So my shelves are quite bare at this point. So before things get too crazy and I have to pack up even more, I wanted to make a few videos with some of the books while I still have them out. So what I'm going to be talking about this episode are Zofloya the Moor, an early 19th century Gothic novel, and Sexuality and the Gothic Magic Lantern, academic text about Gothic Studies. So to start off here, this was the next pick in our sort of informal Gothic literature book club that I have with some other great people. And we had read Mysteries of Udolpho, The Monk, which we really liked. We read Wieland by Charles Brockton Brown last month. And this month, July, was Charlotte Dacre. I think, hopefully I'm saying her name right, although I'm not entirely sure. And her 1806 novel, Zofloya or the Moor. Now, she did not write under her own name. She used a pen name, Rosa Matilda. Sorry, I blinked on it for a second. Rosa Matilda, which was in many ways a play on a character in Matthew Lewis's The Monk, a character who was known as Rosario when it was a woman pretending to be a male, and then Matilda when it was revealed to be a female, a figure of dark temptation. So Charlotte definitely has a very dark Gothic sensibility about her. And this story is about Victoria, who is essentially evil right from the get-go. She's a teenage girl on the cusp of being a young woman, and she is pretty much rotten from the inside, and it is really kind of about her downfall. Now, she doesn't go, like I'm saying right now, from being a good person to a bad person. She's a bad person who pretends to be good until she stops pretending, essentially. And because Charlotte uses Matthew Lewis and the Monk as something of a template and an inspiration, you can definitely see where some elements of the story are going. Now, the introductory essay in this, the Oxford edition, does talk about this book as the book that took the kind of heroines of Anne Radcliffe, that Gothic kind of terror concentration, with the Gothic horror of Matthew Lewis. And I can definitely see that. Victoria is basically put in the situations that you would see a Radcliffean heroine put into. But whereas Radcliffean heroines are kind of innocent and pure and fainting at any leaf that drops next to them, Victoria is a wicked person who is not at all above getting revenge or taking people out who get in her way to get what she wants. So the first half of the book is kind of like that. It's kind of like, what if a heroine in a Radcliffe story was wicked? And the second half, we get introduced to the titular character, Zofloya the Moor, who is a Moorish slave of one of her companions. And they begin something of a partnership in evil. And, even though he's the slave, it becomes apparent pretty quickly that he is really the one in charge. And that's really where the story gets interesting. It does take a while. Now, this isn't the most exciting story, I will admit that. But there are some really good parts. There are certain things that just take too long. Violet is a character who is often described in here the way that we would describe a psychopath. She is somebody who does not have empathy. She could inflict injury without any kind of remorse or regret. And she pretends to have emotions in order to manipulate people, to get what she wants. Those points are actually pretty good in here. The downside of her is that she's incredibly dense in a lot of ways. It's frustrating reading this when, as a reader, you are so far beyond what the main character, Violet, has caught on to, especially if you've read The Monk by Matthew Lewis, which even in 1806, I'm guessing most people had. So you know where the story's going way before Violet does. So that can be kind of frustrating when you're kind of waiting for her to catch up. But this does give us moments where she does have that cruelty, and that's kind of where we get a little more of the Gothic horror coming in. Nice little moments of violence. We have like spurting blood, people getting thrown off cliffs, poison. Those parts are definitely fun when they arrive. I can definitely see why this was such a scandalous and shocking reading in 1806. First of all, it does focus on a woman who is essentially evil. We have a lot of focus in here about female sexual desire and temptation and what they will go to achieve and satiate that sexual desire. That's something I think you saw very often during this time. We have a central character who is wicked. I mean, we're following a villain really right from the very beginning of the story. She's not outright a villain at first, but by the second half of the story, I mean, she is just the villain of the story, and we're seeing it from her perspective, and that's also really neat. The fact that Zofloya is a Moor, and we see Violet start to become attracted to him. I'm not entirely sure how to think about this character of the Moor, and to try and think of it within an 1806 context. This is, I believe, a year before England, and even though her name's very French, she was British. This, I think, is a year before Britain ended the slave trade. And Zofloya, even though he is a Moor, and obviously a darker skin complexion, he looks very exotic, it is very clear pretty early on that he is the smartest and strongest person in the room. Even though he is a slave, I don't see very much in here a very racist attitude towards him. In fact, I almost see a little bit of the opposite, that this is not somebody who really should be enslaved. And you realize, I think, you catch on that if he didn't want to be a slave, he wouldn't have to be. He is way too powerful to be kept in slavery. So he is there for alternative ends. There's something else that he wants. But we see Victoria becoming more and more attracted to him as the story goes on. And I can definitely see how that would be very scandalous during that time period. So overall, I did overall enjoy it. This is not something that I would recommend to a casual reader. Really, it's kind of a Gothic completionist. But so far, it was decent. I think it was a little bit, I mean, it's not even a long book, but it could have been a little bit shorter even. It takes a while for certain things to get to where they need to go, or certain plot lines to resolve. But it does also give us some nice little moments of violence and horror, and it's fun to see this wicked person basically try to take out her enemies. So it was okay. That's kind of where I'm putting it for that. But I'm glad I read it, certainly. And I'm looking forward to continuing on with the Gothic reads. I didn't mention, I also read this, I didn't read this for Jane Austen July, but it does fit one of the prompts, which is to read a contemporary of Jane Austen. So that was one of those. Another thing that I read as part of Jane Austen July was this one. Sexuality and the Gothic Magic Lantern. Desire, Eroticism, and Literary Visibilities from Byron to Bram Stoker by David J. Jones, who has a couple other works, I believe, along these ends. He is somebody who also practices magic lantern, a very old form of entertainment, one that was hugely popular in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. Everybody knew what a a magic lantern was. It was as ubiquitous as cinema. But it's one that's largely forgotten today. And that's kind of the point of this book. Jones looks at certain Gothic works to show how references and influence from the magic lantern influence Gothic literature, and a little bit of vice versa as well. Some literary analysts have read these Gothic works and say, "Wow, it's almost like they're evoking cinema, the way that they talk about things." But of course, it's before cinema. And he's saying, no, it's the Gothic lantern that they are referencing. And I think he does a pretty good job with this. And the other component here is the sexuality, right? Very early on in the 1800s, the magic lanterns, partly because of the content that they would put on, things that look like this, the content that was in the Magic Lanterns, but also the fact that it's people in a dark room. We know what, young couples can do inside a movie theater when it's dark. The same kind of thing would happen occasionally inside Magic Lantern shows, but they began to be associated with a very sexually charged atmosphere, and sexually charged imagery as well. So that also ended up influencing literature, and the influences from that is what he explores. So that's the sexuality is kind of where I get a little bit frustrated with works like this, because he does rely on a very Freudian interpretation of things. I'm not discounting necessarily Freudian interpretations, but I have very little patience for them. When everything's referred to as like phallic, or the tomb is the womb, and when things are sexualized, sometimes it feels to me like you're saying more about yourself than you are about the thing that you're analyzing. So that's the kind of stuff that I would take out of here. I just didn't think that all that, when the Freudian analysis happens, I didn't think it was necessarily necessary. But there are some really good chapters in here. He does actually go through the monk in the introduction, which is pretty nice. I really liked the chapter on Carmilla, by Sharon Lefanu, and that's the chapter called Le Fanu's Carmilla, Lesbian Desire in the Lanternist Novella. I thought that was really good, because I remember reading Carmilla and being struck by the way that Sheridan Le Fanu described the vampire. Especially there's a scene where after she has sort of fed on, I think the character's name is Laura, in bed, the victim describes seeing Carmilla leave the room, but she doesn't get up and walk out of the room. It's like she was closer to her, and then she kept all of a sudden appearing farther away until the door kind of opened and she was out. And you can kind of see that as like somebody zooming in or out of a projection lantern. The way that, she kind of is described as being cat-like in the shadows, but not exactly a cat. You can definitely see that magic lantern technology at work, and being evoked inside that book. That, I think, was, for me, the best chapter. There also is a chapter on Bram Stoker, which looks at Dracula, as well as another work, but the Dracula one was actually really good. And I kept thinking of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie by Francis Ford Coppola, which is a movie that I really like, even though it has its faults. Keanu Reeves is not very good in that movie, of course. You have to be prepared for the melodrama in that movie, but it is such a rich love letter to the vampire in cinema, for the first 100 years of cinema. But also, it looks at shadow play as well, and the kind of thing that you can see inside the magic lantern. Especially when Harker is in Dracula's castle, the shadows when they're moving, and it really made me appreciate the attention to detail of the historical influences that were at work there. Even if I don't know if entirely that stuff was, as far as the magic lantern, if that was conscious, but it certainly is evoked inside that film. But overall, I thought this was pretty good. Some of the analysis was more convincing than others. I will admit that, and the Freudian stuff I can kind of do without. But I really like that chapter on Carmilla. So anyway, these are the 2 books that I read in early July. We have got Zofloya, or the Moor, early 19th century Gothic, and the Sexuality and the Gothic Magic Lantern, Desire, Eroticism, and Literary Visibilities from Byron to Bram Stoker. If you read out of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.